That night flight was supposed to be just an ordinary journey. A female passenger was sitting in first class, a tray of food was placed down, and a loaf of bread that was moldy. But from that moment everything went off track. The woman didn't yell. She didn't insult anyone. She simply asked gently, "Can I change my meal?" Yet a few hours later, when the plane landed, she became a power bully on social media. And the flight attendant who served her was reportedly fired. The question is, what really happened at an altitude of over 3,000 feet, and why was the truth distorted faster than the viral video? If it were you, would you remain silent to avoid trouble, or speak up even knowing you might lose everything? This story isn't just about a flight. It's about choice, about silence, and about the price to pay when someone dares to say, "I deserve respect." If you've ever been misunderstood, ever been told don't make a big deal out of it, or ever wondered if the truth still matters, stay with us. And before we begin this story, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so we can listen together to a very real, very true, and very thought-provoking story. The lights in first class were dimmed just enough for people to see each other's faces, but not bright enough to force anyone to stare into the other's eyes for too long. The night flight from Chicago to San Francisco glided silently across the Midwest sky, carrying strangers, each with their own story. Naomi Carter is seated by the window in row 2A. She wasn't the attention-grabbing type. A simple navy blue blazer, her black hair neatly tied back, her hands resting lightly on a worn, leather-bound notebook. No flashy jewelry, no haughty gaze. At first glance, one might think she was a consultant or a university lecturer who had just finished a long business trip. Naomi was used to it. She was accustomed to entering spaces where her presence was first questioned, and only then, if any, respect. The gentle sound of the food cart wheels rolling on the carpet echoed from the front of the cabin. A flight attendant with blonde hair tied up high and a pleasant smile stopped beside seat 1. "Good evening, sir," she said, her voice sweet and clear. "Chicken or pasta tonight?" The white man in seat 1B smiled in response, asking about the wine. The flight attendant, Emily Ross, leaned toward him patiently, explaining each option, occasionally chuckling softly, as if their conversation was more interesting than the flight itself. Naomi observed the scene not out of curiosity, but because she had seen it so many times in her life. When Emily turned to Naomi's seat, the smile on her lips had almost vanished. Not exactly a frown, just an emptiness. "Chicken or pasta?" Emily asked quickly and concisely, her eyes glancing at Naomi before settling on the tray of food in her hands. "Chicken, please," Naomi replied. Her voice was low and slow, polite enough that no one could find fault with it. Emily placed the tray down on the folding table in front of Naomi, the movement a little forceful. Not a word of "enjoy your meal." No eye contact. She turned away almost immediately. Naomi unfolded the napkin and spread it on her lap. She wasn't in a hurry. Years of work experience had taught her that taking things slowly wasn't a sign of weakness, but of self-control. When Naomi lifted the thin foil, a strange damp smell wafted past her nose before her eyes could even register it. A small loaf of bread sat in the corner of the tray, its surface speckled with grayish-green patches. You didn't need to be a food expert to recognize what it was. Naomi paused for a second. Just 1 second. In that brief moment, a flood of old memories resurfaced. Meals served last. Being asked, "Are you in the right room?" The frowns when she walked into meeting rooms full of people who didn't look like her. She took a deep breath. Naomi pressed the button to call the flight attendant. Emily turned around, her face clearly showing her barely concealed annoyance. "Yes," Naomi pointed lightly at the loaf of bread. "Excuse me, but this bread looks a bit moldy. Can I have a different one?" Emily glanced at the loaf of bread just once, then she exhaled loud enough for Naomi to hear. "Ma'am," she said, drawing out the word. "That's how artisan bread looks sometimes." Naomi remained silent, waiting. Emily continued, her voice rising slightly. If you don't want it, don't eat it. It's complimentary. Naomi looked up. Her eyes held no anger, no defiance, just a calmness that was unsettling. I understand that handmade bread can't be perfect, Naomi said slowly, but this one is clearly moldy. Emily smiled faintly, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. Some people, she said, her voice just loud enough for a few passengers nearby to hear, should be grateful just to be sitting up here. The airplane cabin fell silent for a split second. Naomi felt her heart beat a little faster, not out of fear, but because of that painfully familiar feeling of an invisible boundary being drawn once again. She can react, she can raise her voice, she can call the manager right now, but Naomi didn't do it. She folded the napkin and placed it neatly on the tray. Please, she said, her voice still even. I just need another loaf of bread, if you have any. Emily looked at Naomi for another second, her eyes turning cold. Then she turned her back, pushed the food cart away, leaving Naomi with the moldy loaf of bread in front of her. Nobody said anything. The man in seat 1B was looking down at his phone. A woman in the row opposite him turned her face toward the window. First class, what's called privilege, suddenly felt unusually crowded. Naomi sat still. She had been through worse times than this, but for some reason a moldy loaf of bread on a night flight weighed heavily on her heart. Perhaps she was simply too tired. Perhaps deep down Naomi knew that this wasn't over yet. Naomi Carter remained seated in seat 2A as the food cart rolled further and further back into the compartment. The moldy loaf of bread sat there like something that shouldn't be there, yet no one was in a hurry to deal with it. She didn't push it aside, nor did she cover it with a napkin. She left it, as it was a stark truth, needing no embellishment. Outside the window, the night sky stretched out in a deep blue, occasionally punctuated by the lights of a small city below. Naomi looked out, not necessarily to admire the view but to find some space for herself. She was used to having to create that space herself. No one on this plane knew who Naomi was, and she had no need for them to know. In her world, titles only mattered when used at the right time. Right now, what Naomi needed wasn't power, but calm. Naomi was born and raised in Oakland, California, in a neighborhood where people learned to be strong from a very young age. Her mother was a night shift nurse. Her father worked at a shipyard but lost his job when Naomi was only 12 years old. Her childhood was full of love but never affluent. There were evenings when Naomi sat at the kitchen table doing her homework, listening to her mother whispering on the phone with the bank about requesting an extension for her payments. Those conversations were never directed at Naomi, but her mother still heard them. And she learned a lesson very early on. Life doesn't owe anyone kindness. Everything must be earned, but not through noise or commotion. Naomi isn't the type to dwell on her past. She doesn't use it as a badge of honor. But that past is within her, quiet, steadfast, and shapes how she faces the world. When Naomi entered the tech industry more than 20 years ago, she was the only black woman in boardrooms at many companies. The questions she received rarely began with "What is your idea?" but more often with "What department do you work in?" Once, during an important pitching session, an investor turned to the white man sitting next to Naomi and asked, "She's with you, right?" The man awkwardly chuckled, and before he could answer, Naomi introduced herself, in such a calm voice that the man couldn't ignore her. Moments like these didn't anger Naomi. They actually brought her back to her senses. She learned how to choose her battles. On this night flight, Naomi didn't stand up immediately, not because she was afraid, but because she was considering her options. She understood all too well how small situations could be distorted into entirely different narratives, especially when a black woman was labeled annoying or aggressive simply for speaking up. Naomi has paid the price for those labels enough in her life. She opened her notebook but wrote nothing. The blank pages reflected the soft light in the cabin, as if inviting her to record her thoughts. But Naomi knew there were things that shouldn't be written down right now, at least not yet. The soft clinking of forks and spoons came from the seat in front. The man in seat 1B was eating, looking quite content. Naomi wasn't envious. She just saw a very familiar disparity. She recalled that afternoon in Chicago when she stood on the stage of a conference on sustainable innovation. The auditorium was packed. When Naomi spoke about corporate social responsibility, the entire audience rose to their feet and applauded. Someone called her speech quietly powerful. Naomi didn't like the compliments, but she understood what they meant. The strength she possessed wasn't something overwhelming. It was the strength of perseverance, of not letting herself be swept away by fleeting emotions. She knew that if she reacted immediately when Emily Ross made that sarcastic remark, things could take a different turn. A turn Naomi had seen too many times: phone cameras raised, the story distorted, and the truth becoming the least important thing. Naomi gently closed her eyes for a few seconds. A silent dialogue was taking place in her mind. Should I ignore it? If I ignore it, what am I teaching myself? If I speak up, what risks am I putting myself at? There is no perfect answer. Naomi opened her eyes and looked back at the moldy loaf of bread. This time she didn't see it as just spoiled food. It was a small but sharp symbol of the things people thought they could offer her and expect her to accept in silence. She folded the tray shut and pressed the call button for the flight attendant again. This time it wasn't Emily Ross who appeared, but a different flight attendant, younger, with brown hair and a slightly confused look in her eyes. "Yes, ma'am," she asked, her voice softer. Naomi didn't rush to answer. She just smiled, a very small smile, then pointed to the tray of food. "Could I speak to the cabin manager?" Naomi asked. The young flight attendant nodded, seemingly relieved that she didn't have to handle it directly. "Yes, I'll let you know." As she left, Naomi sensed a few curious glances from those around her. She didn't turn back. She knew that from this moment on, things would begin to move. And once the wheels started turning, it would be difficult to stop. Naomi didn't know that at the back of the compartment Emily Ross was standing with her arms crossed, her eyes darkening as she watched her colleague turn towards seat 2A. She couldn't hear what they were saying, but Emily had a feeling the situation was no longer under her control. Naomi, on the other hand, felt a strange clarity, not anger, rather a gentle determination, similar to when she decided to leave a safe company to build her own business, even though everyone said she was crazy. There were times in Naomi's life when she understood that doing nothing was also an option, and she chose silence far too often to protect herself. This time she chose differently. At the front of the compartment, the cockpit door creaked open. Naomi had no idea that the person about to step off would completely change the rhythm of this flight and the days to come in her life. She knew only one thing: the silence before her was not the end. It was merely the pause before everything began. The food cart had vanished from the first-class cabin, leaving behind a strange void. That void wasn't in the aisle, but in the air. It hovered invisible, yet everyone could feel it. Naomi Carter sat upright in seat 2A. She didn't move. She didn't look around. She didn't check her phone. She maintained absolute neutrality, as if everything that had just happened was a minor detail not worth paying attention to. But that's not actually the case. Naomi could clearly feel the eyes beginning to turn towards her. Not directly, not overtly curious. Rather, they were quick glances before turning away, like people witnessing something uncomfortable and not knowing where to stand in the conversation. A middle-aged woman sitting opposite Naomi subtly adjusted her seatbelt, a superfluous gesture since the plane had long since stabilized. The man in seat 1B leaned even deeper into his phone screen, as if something incredibly important was happening on it. Naomi understood these reactions. She had seen them in boardrooms, in elevators, at networking parties where she was the only one who wasn't like the crowd. It's not hostility, it's avoidance. And sometimes avoidance hurts more than confrontation. A moment later, light footsteps sounded from behind. Naomi turned her head very slowly, just enough to see Emily Ross approaching, not with a stroller, but with a small notebook in her hand. Her gait was no longer as relaxed as before. Her shoulders were slightly stiff, her chin was raised higher than necessary. Emily stopped next to Naomi's seat without bending down or smiling. "Ma'am," she said, her voice now carrying a different tone. Colder, more formal. "I understand you requested to speak with a supervisor." Naomi nodded. "Yes." Emily took a deep breath as if bracing for an unpleasant exchange. "Before I call the cabin manager, I need to clarify a few things. We serve according to standard procedures." "And what you call mold," Naomi interrupted very softly. "I don't need to argue. I just want to speak to someone in authority." Emily froze for a fraction of a second. Very briefly. But enough for Naomi to realize. "You're making things more complicated than necessary," Emily continued, her voice slightly raised. "This is a night flight. Everyone's trying to rest." Naomi looked directly at Emily for the first time since the conversation began. Her gaze wasn't harsh, but it was so steady that Emily swallowed hard. "I'm trying to rest too," Naomi replied. "And I don't think asking for a safe meal complicates things." Some passengers began to pay closer attention. There was the sound of seats shifting. A slight cough. No one spoke, but their presence weighed heavily on the conversation. Emily smiled faintly, but the smile quickly faded. "Fine," she said. "I'll get the supervisor." She turned and walked quickly toward the front of the compartment. Naomi watched, feeling her heart rate quicken slightly. Not out of fear, but because she knew that when conversations like this took place in front of a crowd, the truth was often not the deciding factor. About 5 minutes passed. Long enough for curiosity to turn into tension. Naomi realized she was being watched more than ever. Not because she was noisy, but because she had broken the silence that had been so convenient for everyone. Another flight attendant, the young woman who had arrived earlier, glanced at Naomi with a look of concern. She didn't stop. Just long enough for Naomi to see the hesitation in her eyes. Naomi didn't blame the girl. She understood that feeling. The feeling of wanting to do the right thing but being afraid of the consequences. Finally, Michael Turner, the cabin crew and captain of the flight, appeared. He was a man in his 50s with streaks of gray in his hair and the calm demeanor of someone accustomed to handling stressful situations at altitudes exceeding 30,000 feet. He leaned down to Naomi's eye level. "Good evening, ma'am. I'm Captain Turner. I understand there's an issue with your meal." Naomi nodded, pointing to the tray of food. "Yes, this loaf of bread is moldy. I just asked for a different one." Michael Turner examined the loaf of bread very closely. It didn't take him long to notice the problem. A frown appeared between his eyebrows. "I'm very sorry about this," he said immediately. His voice was sincere, without any hint of defensiveness. "This should not have happened." Emily Ross stood behind her, arms crossed. Naomi didn't turn to look, but she could sense the tension emanating from her. Michael Turner turned to Emily. "Emily, did you check the tray before serving?" Emily opened her mouth, then closed it again. "Aye, this is how those rolls sometimes look." Michael shook his head. "This is clearly mold." The airplane cabin was eerily silent. Something very small, yet very important, just happened. For the first time since the start of the flight, someone in authority called the event by its proper name. Emily bowed her head quickly, then looked up again. "I was just following procedure." Naomi heard that and almost smiled, not out of amusement, but because she'd heard it so many times in so many different contexts. Michael Turner returns to Naomi. "I sincerely apologize for the inconvenience and for how this was handled. We'll replace your meal immediately." He stood up straight, his voice clearer, loud enough for those around him to hear. "This is not acceptable service." A few passengers nodded slightly. The woman opposite Naomi breathed a sigh of relief, as if someone had finally said what she hadn't dared to say. Emily Ross clenched her fists. Naomi noticed it as Emily brushed past her to leave. Emily's gaze lingered on Naomi for a very brief moment, but there was something in it that wasn't remorse. It's like suppressed anger. Michael Turner gestured for another flight attendant to bring a new tray. He bowed to Naomi once more before turning back towards the cockpit. Naomi sat back down, the tension in her chest easing slightly. But deep down she knew this wasn't the end of it. She had seen that look before. The look of people who wouldn't accept being corrected, people who considered having their mistakes pointed out a personal humiliation. Naomi watched the moldy loaf of bread being taken away. It disappeared from the tray, but the feeling it left behind didn't. She wondered how many of the times she chose to remain silent to avoid trouble it only led to these behaviors repeating themselves. The plane continued its journey smooth and quiet as if nothing had happened. But Naomi knew that there are storms that don't form in the sky. They are formed within people's hearts. And sometimes they just wait until the plane lands. The new food tray was placed down in front of Naomi Carter with much more care than before. This time the loaf of bread looked so perfect, almost too flawless, its pale yellow surface blemish-free. The young flight attendant paused for a moment, bowing slightly. "I apologize for the inconvenience, ma'am," she said softly, as if afraid to break the fragile silence in the compartment. Naomi nodded. "Thank you." The flight attendant smiled, then quickly left, leaving Naomi alone with the new tray of food and a feeling that was hard to describe. On the surface, the problem was solved. The moldy bread was gone. An apology had been given. An authority figure had sided with the truth. But Naomi knew that stories like this rarely end so cleanly. She unfolded her napkin but didn't eat immediately. Her hand rested on the edge of the folding table, her fingers lightly touching the cool plastic surface. She felt her heartbeat return to normal, but her mind remained clear. Naomi glanced around. First class seemed to have breathed a sigh of relief. The man in seat 1B resumed his meal, even ordering another glass of wine. The woman opposite Naomi took out a book and started reading as if all the tension from earlier had vanished like a breeze. Naomi realized that this normalcy was what troubled her. She recalled an evening many years ago when she was a young manager. At that time she had spoken up in a meeting about how a colleague had treated a subordinate disrespectfully. The meeting ended in a heavy silence. Afterwards, Naomi was advised to be gentler, more flexible, because not everyone is ready for difficult conversations. At that moment she stepped back, not because she was wrong, but because she was tired. Naomi wondered what would happen if she stepped back this time as well, not just for her but for others who would sit in seat 2A on other flights. People who might not have a voice, the confidence, or simply the energy to protest. She picked up her knife and fork, then put them down. Not because she wasn't hungry, but because she was thinking. At the far end of the compartment, Emily Ross stood near the small kitchenette, pretending to arrange dishes. Naomi didn't look directly at her, but she sensed Emily's gaze occasionally flicking over. The look wasn't as intense as before. It held a more complex emotion, a mixture of anger, confusion, and a touch of hurt. Naomi wasn't pleased about it. She had never believed that embarrassing someone was a victory. But she couldn't ignore what had happened either. The plane lurched slightly as it passed through a turbulent area. The seatbelt sign lit up, accompanied by a familiar chime. A few passengers subtly adjusted their positions. Naomi leaned back in her seat, but her eyes remained open. The questions kept swirling in her mind. If I say one more word, will anyone consider it causing trouble? If I remain silent, will that mean acceptance? Naomi understood the cost of both options. The seatbelt warning light went off. Michael Turner stepped out of the cockpit and walked down the aisle to inspect the cabin. As he passed Naomi's seat, his gaze lingered for a moment, not out of suspicion, but because he wanted to make sure everything was all right. "Everything okay now, ma'am?" he asked, his voice low and deep. Naomi looked up. This was the moment she knew that if she spoke, the story would take a different turn. "Yes," she replied after a brief pause. "Thank you for handling it." Michael Turner nodded, but he didn't leave immediately. "If there's anything else, please let us know." Naomi looked at him. In her eyes there was something that made Michael pause longer than usual. Not words, but a clear sense of consideration. Actually, Naomi said, her voice still soft, I wanted to add one more thing. The plane seemed to slow down. Naomi felt several eyes turn toward her. No one said anything, but the attention was back on. Michael Turner tilted his head. Yes, ma'am. Naomi chose her words carefully, as she always did in important meetings. I understand that everyone has a bad day at work. But the way I was spoken to just now wasn't just about the meal. Emily Ross looked up from the back of the compartment. Naomi didn't turn to look, but she knew Emily was listening. I don't want anyone to be disciplined for this, Naomi continued. But I think it's important that it's recognized for what it truly is. Michael Turner was silent for a few seconds. Then he nodded slowly. I understand. Naomi said nothing more. She didn't need to explain at length. She knew the person in front of her was intelligent enough to understand what she wasn't saying. Michael Turner turned and walked toward the cockpit. But before going inside, he stopped and exchanged a brief word with another flight attendant. Naomi couldn't hear the conversation clearly, but she noticed the way the flight attendant nodded, sounding much more serious. The atmosphere in the compartment changed very subtly. No one spoke, but something had just been put in its proper place. Naomi sat back, feeling both lighter and heavier in her chest. Light because she hadn't ignored it. Heavy because she knew that when something is acknowledged, it can also be interpreted in many different ways. She began to eat slowly. Each bite tasted strangely ordinary. No better, no worse. But Naomi realized she wasn't paying much attention to the meal anymore. In her mind, the image of Emily Ross's eyes when Michael Turner said, "This is clearly mold," kept flashing. Not the eyes of someone who recognizes a mistake, but the eyes of someone who feels challenged. Naomi has worked with all sorts of people and understands that some people don't see truth as a fact. They see it as a threat. The plane continued to glide through the night sky. The cabin lights were dimmed even further, signaling that most passengers should rest. Some closed their eyes. Some put on their headphones. Naomi leaned her head back against the seat, looking out the window. The city lights below were becoming more numerous. They were getting closer to the west coast. She wondered if once the plane's wheels touched down, everything would truly stop there. Or if what had just happened was merely the prelude to something bigger. At the far end of the compartment, Emily Ross still stood there, her back to Naomi, but her hands were clenched so tightly that her knuckles were white. Naomi didn't see it, but even if she did, she wouldn't be happy about it. She chose to speak out, not to win against anyone, but to avoid betraying herself. And sometimes it is these small, seemingly ordinary choices that trigger the biggest waves. The plane began to descend very gently. A familiar voice came from the loudspeaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be beginning our descent into San Francisco shortly." Naomi closed her eyes for a few seconds. She didn't know that once the plane touched down, her life, and Emily Ross's life, would no longer follow its familiar straight paths. The sound of the wheels landing on the runway was sharp and lasted for a few seconds before the plane slowed down. The first-class cabin vibrated slightly, then gradually stabilized. A few passengers breathed a sigh of relief, as if they had just completed a tiring journey. Naomi Carter opened her eyes as the plane slowly taxied toward the gate. She hadn't slept. She had only closed her eyes to detach herself from the thoughts swirling gently in her head. Michael Turner's deep, familiar voice boomed from the loudspeaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to San Francisco. Local time is 9:42 p.m. Please remain seated until the aircraft comes to a complete stop." A scattered round of applause broke the silence. The atmosphere in the cabin lightened, as if all tension had been packed up and stored in the overhead luggage compartment. Naomi looked around. The man in seat 1B had stood up as soon as the seatbelt sign went off, stretching comfortably. The woman opposite Naomi rearranged her books, giving a polite smile to a passing flight attendant. "Everything looks normal." Naomi wondered if it was this very ordinariness that made such stories so easily forgotten. An incident is dealt with, an apology is given, and then everyone goes back to their lives. If Naomi were to get off the plane right now, she might as well choose that option. She can call a driver, go back to her apartment, take a hot shower, and wake up tomorrow morning, continue her busy work schedule, as if nothing happened. That thought flashed through his mind, then vanished. When the plane came to a complete stop, the cabin door opened and two people in airline management uniforms stepped aboard. One male, one female. They had a serious demeanor and their eyes quickly scanned the cabin. Naomi recognized them instantly, not because she knew them, but because she was all too familiar with this kind of appearance. While everything had been handled internally, a final confirmation was still needed for reassurance. The female manager stopped at the back of the compartment, exchanging a quick word with Michael Turner. The man stepped forward, his gaze settling on Emily Ross. "Miss Ross," he said, his voice low but clear, "please come with us." Emily Ross paused for a moment, just a very brief moment. Then she adjusted her name tag and stepped forward. Her back was straight, but Naomi noticed her shoulders were stiffer than usual. "Is there a problem?" Emily asked. "Let's discuss it off the aircraft," the female manager replied, showing no emotion. The first-class cabin fell silent. A few passengers looked up curious. Naomi didn't look at Emily, but she sensed movement as Emily walked past her seat. In that moment, Emily glanced at Naomi. The look wasn't anger, nor was it exactly fear. It was more like a mixture of surprise and hurt. Naomi kept her gaze fixed ahead. She didn't want to turn this moment into a personal victory. Emily was led out of the compartment. The door closed behind her. Everything happened quickly, smoothly, and quietly, exactly the kind of thing large organizations prefer. The male manager turned around and faced the passengers. "On behalf of the airline, we apologize for any inconvenience during this flight. Appropriate action has been taken." Those words were spoken smoothly, as if rehearsed. A few passengers nodded in satisfaction. There was a very faint murmur which quickly subsided. Naomi sat still. She felt neither triumphant nor relieved as she had expected. Michael Turner approached Naomi before passengers began disembarking. "Miss Carter," he said, calling her by her first name for the first time during the flight. "I want to personally apologize again for what happened." Naomi was slightly surprised, but didn't show it. "Thank you. Your entire fare has been compiled," Michael continued. "And we've added a credit to your account for future travel." Naomi nodded. "I understand." Michael hesitated for a moment, then added, "If you'd like to follow up, this is the incident number." He handed her a small card with a few lines written on the back. Naomi took it. The card was thin and light, but in her hand it carried a different kind of weight. It was proof that this had been recorded, at least on paper. "Thank you," Naomi said. She looked at Michael Turner, then added very softly, "I hope this will help make future flights better." Michael nodded, his eyes serious. "So do I." Passengers began lining up to disembark the plane. The man in seat 1B walked past Naomi, pausing briefly. "I saw what happened," he said quickly, as if he didn't want to prolong the conversation. "That wasn't right." Naomi smiled slightly. "Thank you." The woman opposite Naomi also nodded slightly as she passed. "You handled that with a lot of grace." Naomi responded with a polite smile. Those words didn't make her feel victorious, but they reminded her that someone had seen. And that mattered. When Naomi stood up, the first-class cabin was almost empty. The young flight attendant who had brought the fresh meal tray earlier walked past and whispered, "I'm sorry you had to go through that." Naomi paused. "Thank you," she said. "And thank you for doing the right thing." The young girl bowed her head, her expression a mixture of relief and anxiety. Naomi stepped off the plane and walked through the jet bridge leading to the terminal. The cool San Francisco air rushed in, carrying the familiar scent of the sea and metal. She took a deep breath. Everything seems to be done. Emily Ross was escorted away. The airline apologized. The incident was handled according to procedure. Naomi slowed her pace as she entered the station. The lights were brighter, the voices were louder. Life went on as it always did. She took out her phone, preparing to text the driver. The screen lit up, and at the same time a notification appeared. Not a text message, not a work email, a notification from social media. Naomi frowned. Then she opened it. The headline appeared in bold black on a white background. Corporate executive gets flight attendant fired over bread complaint. Naomi stood still amidst the moving crowd. Her heart sank slightly. She opened another notification. Then another one. Working mother loses job. After confrontation with passenger power and privilege at 30000 feet. Naomi felt a chill run down her spine. Justice, it turns out, has many versions. And the version that just appeared on her phone screen wasn't the reality of what she had just experienced. San Francisco train station at night always has a unique rhythm. White lights stretch across the polished tile floor. Streams of people dragging their suitcases pass each other, each carrying the weariness of a long day. Naomi Carter blended into that flow, walking slowly, her mind still lingering on the first-class carriage she had just left. She stood near the empty conveyor belt, opened her phone again. New notifications kept appearing more incessantly than before. The headlines were short, sharp, and cold. Entitled, "Executive Causes Scene on Red-Eye Flight. Flight Attendant Fired After Passenger Complaint." Naomi read each line slowly without rushing. She was used to being confronted with words carefully crafted to grab attention. But this time, there was something different. She opened an article. The cover photo was of Emily Ross being led off the plane just as the terminal lights shone on her pale face. There was no background, no moldy bread, no the words Naomi had heard so clearly on board. There was only one sentence. A businesswoman used her influence to pressure a flight attendant into losing her job. Naomi let out a soft sigh, not out of anger, but because of the familiar feeling of being deprived of context. She scrolled down the content. A quote placed in quotation marks and attributed to an internal source of the airline read, "The passenger was aggressive, demanded disciplinary action, and threatened consequences if their demands were not met." Naomi frowned. None of the words in that passage matched what she had said. She opened another link, then another. Different articles, but the same tone, the same structure, as if they all came from a single recording. Naomi paused. She understood what this meant. Somewhere else, not on an airplane, a different story was being written. She pulled her suitcase off the conveyor belt, noticing her hands were colder than usual. Naomi stepped aside, opening the most shared video. The headline scrolled quickly, full of drama. The video begins with Emily Ross standing in the hallway, her face tense. The background music is turned up loud. Michael Turner's voice is heard, but it cuts off before the apology. The footage quickly shifts to the moment Emily is led away. Then a message appeared on the screen: "She didn't deserve this." Naomi looked very closely. She noticed the gaps, the parts that had been cut away. There was no scene of her pointing at the loaf of bread. There was no moment where Michael Turner said, "This is clearly mold." There was no moment where she said she didn't want anyone disciplined. Only a few pieces are enough to suggest a different story. A simpler story. Easier to share. Naomi turned off the video. The phone rang. It was a call from Rachel Moore, the communications director for Naomi's company. "Naomi," Rachel said as soon as the call connected. Her voice was low and urgent. "Are you seeing what's going on?" "Yes," Naomi replied. "I'm at the airport. There are reporters in the baggage claim area," Rachel said. "Someone gave them the passenger list. We need to avoid contact right now." Naomi closed her eyes for a second. "Someone," she repeated very softly. Rachel continued, "We're tracing the source. It appears an internal report was sent out." "Which report?" Naomi asked. A brief silence. "The flight attendant's report. She submitted it immediately upon landing." Naomi felt a heavy weight on her chest. "The contents," Rachel sighed. "That's completely different from what you told me. They described you as a troublemaker, called for disciplinary action and abuse of influence." Naomi opened her eyes. People continued to pass by her, unaware that her world had just tilted a corner. "There are witnesses," Naomi said. "There's video." "Yes," Rachel replied. "But right now the video being shared is a spliced version. And that report is being cited as official documentation." Naomi understood. In the first few hours of a story spreading, what's called official often prevails whether it's true or not. "What do we do?" Naomi asked. Rachel didn't answer immediately. "For now, no comment. I'm arranging for a car to pick you up at the side exit. Don't go through the press area." Naomi glanced towards the conveyor belt next to her. Indeed, at the far end of the hall, several people were holding cameras, their lights directed at the stream of passengers. One of them looked up, his gaze lingering on Naomi longer than usual. "Okay," Naomi said. "Send me the location." The call ended. Naomi pulled her suitcase and turned into a less crowded hallway. Each step she took was calm, but in her mind questions clashed. Who provided the report? Why did it spread so quickly? And why is this story being told in only one way? Outside the parking lot, a black car was waiting. Naomi got into the back seat. The door closed and the outside world was separated by thick glass. She leaned her head back against the chair and opened her phone again. A new message from an unknown number appeared. "She's a single mother. You ruined her life." Naomi stared at the words for a long time. There were no threats, no insults, just a conclusion stated as an obvious truth. She typed a few words, then deleted them, typed again, then deleted them again. Finally, Naomi locked the screen. There are answers she knew that shouldn't be given in the midst of a storm. The car rolled out of the airport. Streetlights stretched endlessly outside the window. Naomi recalled Emily Ross's gaze as she was escorted off the plane. That gaze now was being used to write another story, a story that placed Emily at the center of sympathy. Naomi didn't hate it. She didn't deny the struggles of others. But she also couldn't accept the distortion of the truth to serve a simplified message. The phone rang again. This time, it was an email from Board Relations. The subject line was concise, urgent media situation. Naomi opened it. The content was only a few lines. "We are closely monitoring the situation. Several partners have contacted us expressing concerns about the brand image. We request that you refrain from commenting until further notice." Naomi finished reading and closed her phone. In that moment, she understood that this story was no longer confined to the realm of a flight. It had entered another dimension, a place where power, public opinion, and truth don't always go hand in hand. The car turned onto the road along the bay. The sea breeze intensified, carrying a salty chill. Naomi looked out the window and saw the city lights reflecting on the dark water. She wondered if the truth needed time to come to light. What would people have to endure during that time, somewhere within a system she hadn't fully grasped? A fabricated report had accomplished its purpose, shaping the narrative before the truth could emerge. Naomi clenched her fist slightly, then relaxed it. She had faced bigger crises before, but she also knew this time was different, because it started with a moldy loaf of bread, and it's being nurtured by things she never said. The next morning, Naomi Carter woke up before her alarm clock went off. The dim light of San Francisco filtered through the curtains, casting a pale gray hue on the ceiling. The city was still half asleep, but the world outside Naomi's apartment was not. Her phone lay on the bedside table, vibrating incessantly. Notifications piled up like small but constant waves crashing against the shore. Naomi sat up and reached for her phone. She didn't rush to answer it. She had learned that in times like these, the first reaction wasn't usually the wisest. She walked into the kitchen, poured herself a glass of water, and leaned against the ice counter. When Naomi opened her phone, the screen displayed dozens of unread messages. From colleagues, from old friends, from people she hadn't spoken to in years, and from people she had never met. "I thought you were better than this. You should apologize." "How could you do that to a working mom?" Naomi read slowly. Not because she didn't understand, but because she was trying to see how much her story had been distorted. She turned on a morning news program. The familiar face of a news anchor appeared with fast-moving text below. Corporate power versus working class. A viral airline incident. The image on the screen was Naomi, an old photo from a conference a few years ago placed next to a picture of Emily Ross in her flight attendant uniform. The two images were digitally manipulated, creating a stark contrast. The presenter spoke in a voice just sharp enough to capture attention. The question is, when power speaks, who will pay the price? Naomi muted the sound. She didn't need to listen further to know the rest. She had seen this structure before in other stories with other characters. This time it was simply her turn to be at the center. The phone vibrated. A call from Rachel Moore. "Naomi," Rachel said as soon as Naomi answered the phone. "Are you watching the news?" "Yes," Naomi replied. "I'm at home." "We're being drawn into a very unfavorable narrative," Rachel said. "They're framing the story as a class confrontation. Powerful CEO versus single mother flight attendant." Naomi closed her eyes for a moment. "Emily has a baby," Rachel hesitated. "No one has confirmed it. But that's the detail that's being circulated most widely." Naomi said nothing. She put the phone down on the table and looked out the window. Outside, the trams passed by. Everything was operating as usual. "The board is in an emergency meeting," Rachel continued. "Several major partners have called. They're concerned about the public reaction." "And what do they want me to do?" Naomi asked, her voice even. Rachel lowered her voice. "They want you to issue a statement. A conciliatory apology." Naomi opened her eyes. "Sorry for what?" A longer than usual silence followed. "Because of public sentiment," Rachel said softly. Naomi chuckled softly, not because it was funny but because she had already guessed the answer. "Should I apologize for asking for a loaf of bread that wasn't moldy?" Naomi asked. "Or should I apologize for not keeping quiet?" Rachel didn't answer immediately. "Naomi, I understand, but right now the truth isn't the only thing being considered." Naomi looked down at her hands. The veins were slightly prominent. Hands that had signed hundreds of contracts, made decisions that affected thousands of people. "Rachel," Naomi said slowly, "I'm not going to apologize for something I didn't do." There was silence on the other end of the line. Then Rachel sighed. "I know. But you need to prepare yourself. This is going to escalate." Naomi ended the call and stood still for a long time. She wasn't angry. She was tired. On social media, short videos continued to be shared. Comments appeared so quickly that Naomi couldn't read them all. "This is why CEOs can't be trusted. Eat the rich. She ruined someone's life over bread." One hashtag started appearing more frequently. Stand with Emily. Naomi typed her name into the search box. A series of results appeared. She didn't click on all of them. She just needed to see the trends. The story no longer belongs to her. It has become the common property of the masses. At lunchtime, Naomi received an official email from the company's executive team. The wording was carefully chosen, but the message was clear. "While we wait for things to calm down, we suggest that you temporarily withdraw from public activities." Naomi read it over and over. Temporarily. A very convenient word. It wasn't dismissal, nor was it support. It was a deliberate silence. Naomi closed her laptop and leaned back in her chair. She thought of her employees, those who had sent messages of support, but didn't dare to express it publicly. She didn't blame them. That afternoon, a reporter called Naomi directly on her personal number. She had no idea how he got the number. "Miss Carter," a man's voice said as Naomi picked up the phone. "Do you have any comment on the allegations?" "Which alliances?" Naomi asked. "That she used her power to pressure the airline?" Naomi was silent for a few seconds. "No," she said. "I have no comment." "Isn't your silence an admission of guilt?" the reporter continued to ask. Naomi hung up the phone. She stood up and walked out onto the balcony. A strong breeze from the bay blew gently, ruffling her hair. Below, the city remained noisy, indifferent to her personal crises. Naomi thought of Emily Ross, not with anger, but with an uneasy unease. Where is Emily right now? Is she being comforted, or is she being exploited? And who is really writing this story? The phone vibrated again. A new message sender, unknown. You thought you won. You didn't. Naomi read the message very slowly. She didn't know who it was from, but she understood the message. This war has only just begun. She turned back inside, closing the balcony door. The late afternoon light streamed into the room, casting Naomi's shadow long across the floor. The shadow looked smaller than usual, but Naomi knew that this feeling of insignificance was only temporary. Some storms don't come to knock you down. They come to test whether you can stand firm. Naomi took a deep breath, and for the first time since leaving the plane, she wondered if silence continued to be interpreted in this way. Was it time for her to do the opposite? The night in San Francisco descends very slowly. The lights outside Naomi Carter's apartment window weren't as dazzling as Manhattan nor as glittering as Los Angeles. They stood there silently, like witnesses accustomed to watching people go through their own ups and downs. Naomi sat alone on the sofa with the main lights off. Only the small table lamp in the corner of the room cast a warm light just enough to prevent the room from being completely dark. She had changed her clothes. Her blazer was neatly folded on the chair. Her shoes were placed tidily by the door. Everything was in its proper place, a habit Naomi had maintained for years, as if external order could help her maintain internal order. The phone lay face down on the coffee table. Naomi didn't want to look at it anymore. Not because she was afraid, but because she needed some real quiet time. She poured herself a cup of hot tea, the faint scent of mint wafting through the air. Naomi sat down, cupping the teacup in her hands, feeling the warmth gradually spread to her palms. In that moment, Naomi allowed herself to be tired. It wasn't physical exhaustion. It was exhaustion from having to constantly remain calm. Exhaustion from having to carefully consider every word, every reaction, every expression, simply because she knew that for someone like her, everything could be interpreted in the most unfavorable way. She recalled the first time her mother told her about it. Naomi, then 16 years old, had just returned home from a class where a teacher had publicly questioned her abilities in front of the class. Angry and with tears in her eyes, Naomi asked her mother why she always had to try harder than others. Her mother looked at Naomi for a long time, then said something that Naomi would never forget. "You don't have to be perfect," she said, "but you have to be careful, because this world doesn't allow you to make as many mistakes as they do for others." Naomi has lived by that saying for most of her life. She chose to remain silent in many situations. Not because she agreed, but because she knew that sometimes silence was the only way to move forward without being dragged down. But tonight, that silence began to take on a different form. Naomi set down her teacup, stood up, and walked to the bookshelf. She pulled out an old photo album. The slightly faded prints captured moments Naomi rarely mentioned in interviews. Naomi as a child, with her hair braided in pigtails, standing in front of her old house in Oakland. Naomi in her college graduation gown, her mother standing beside her, her eyes filled with pride. Naomi at the opening of her first office with only 4 employees and a big dream. She turned the pages slowly. In each photograph, Naomi sees a common thread. She doesn't smile broadly. She doesn't pose. She doesn't show off. She stands there steadfast, as if knowing the road ahead won't be easy, but still choosing to walk it. Naomi paused at a photograph of her mother in her nurse's uniform. Her mother stood in the hospital hallway, the fluorescent lights illuminating her face, which appeared tired but resilient. Naomi recalled the nights her mother came home very late, her voice hoarse from talking so much. The times her mother stood up to defend patients who had been treated disrespectfully. She didn't yell, she just spoke very clearly, very directly, and mothers don't always get thanked for that. Naomi closed the album. The phone vibrated on the coffee table. Naomi looked at it, hesitating. Then she picked it up. The screen displayed the name Evelyn Carter, her mother. Naomi took a deep breath before answering the phone. "Mom," Evelyn's voice rang out deep and familiar. "You're home?" "Yes," Naomi replied. "I'm fine." Evelyn was silent for a few seconds. Naomi knew that was how her mother listened to what wasn't said. "I've seen the news," Evelyn said. "Not all of it. Just enough to know where you stand in that story." Naomi closed her eyes. "What do you think, Mom? Did I do something wrong?" Evelyn asked very directly. Naomi didn't need to think long. "No." "Then you did the right thing," Evelyn said. "Whether the world sees it or not, that's not always in your hands." Naomi felt a lump in her throat. "But I stayed silent, Mom, and now people are telling that story their way." "Silence isn't always a sign of giving up," Evelyn said, "but it's not always the answer either." Naomi leaned back in her chair, her eyes fixed on the ceiling. "I don't want to become a divisive symbol. I can't control that," Evelyn replied. "I can only control whether or not I live true to myself." The call ended after a few brief conversations about very ordinary things. But as Naomi hung up, she felt something stir within her. She returned to her small desk by the window. The laptop was still closed. Naomi opened it, watching the screen light up. Emails, messages, interview requests, criticisms, they were all there waiting for her response. Naomi didn't answer immediately. She opened a blank document. "The cursor is blinking, be patient." Naomi placed her hands on the keyboard, then paused. Two voices echoed in her head. A familiar, cautious voice said, "Don't do anything, everything will calm down." Another voice, deeper but firm, said, "If you don't tell your story, someone else will." Naomi closed her eyes. She remembered the moldy loaf of bread. She remembered Emily Ross's gaze. She remembered the moment Michael Turner said, "This is clearly mold." She remembered what had been cut from the video. The truth doesn't disappear just because people don't see it. It's just waiting for someone patient and courageous enough to bring it to light. Naomi opened her eyes. She started typing. Not fast, not rushed. Just the first few lines, very simple. Not for excuses, not for attacks, just to record what happened. Outside, the city continued its rhythm of life, but in that small room a quiet decision had just been made. Naomi had no idea that in the coming days her silence would be broken in ways she least expected. And that there was someone she had never met, holding a piece of the puzzle that neither side had yet seen. The next morning, while a thin layer of fog still clung to the buildings along the bay, Naomi Carter was already sitting at her desk. Her laptop was open, the documents from the previous night still there, the lines of text left unfinished, like an incomplete sentence. She hasn't sent it. She hasn't published it. She hasn't told anyone other than Rachel Moore. Naomi understood that once the story was made public, there was no turning back. But she also knew that some things become more easily distorted the longer they are left untold. The landline phone rang. Not a personal number. It was a work line. "Miss Carter," the man's voice rang out, formal and emotionless. "This is Jonathan Hale, legal counsel for the airline." Naomi paused for a moment. "Yes, thank you for taking the call," Jonathan said. "We wanted to discuss a resolution regarding the incident on Flight 782. Naomi leaned back in her chair. She wasn't surprised. In fact, she'd been waiting for this call. "We have reviewed the entire situation," Jonathan continued. "And to avoid any unnecessary misunderstandings, the company is willing to offer a good faith agreement." Naomi looked out the window. The bay's surface sparkled in the early morning sun. "What deal?" Jonathan paused briefly, as if double-checking each word. "A substantial financial settlement, along with a written acknowledgement of the inconvenience she experienced." Naomi nodded, even though she knew the person on the other end of the line couldn't see her. And in return, Jonathan replied immediately, as if prepared. "A confidentiality agreement. No further comments on this matter. No sharing of documents, images, or related information." Naomi closed her eyes for a moment. She has signed many NDAs in her life, with partners, with investors. in complex deals where silence was necessary for things to work out, but this time the feeling was completely different. "Does this agreement include retracting the false report?" Naomi asked. Jonathan paused for a moment. "That report is an internal document. It reflects the perspective of the staff." "Perspective," Naomi repeated. "Even if it's not true, Miss Carter," Jonathan said, his voice even. "We don't want to escalate." Naomi opened her eyes. "Me neither." Jonathan lowered his voice, as if shifting to a different level of conversation. "We understand you are a public figure. Situations like this can have unnecessary repercussions. This agreement will help all parties move forward." Move forward. Naomi had heard that phrase too many times. It was often used to mask the fact that someone had to swallow the truth to maintain peace. "Show me the document," Naomi said. An email arrived almost immediately. The attachment was thick pages of small print, densely packed with terms and conditions. Naomi didn't read it quickly. She skimmed through the main body, then paused at the section highlighted in bold. "Party A agrees not to make any public statements directly or indirectly regarding the events that occurred on the flight." Naomi continued reading. Each line was like a door being closed. "She called Rachel Moore." "Rachel," Naomi said when the call connected. "They sent the NDA." Rachel sighed. "I guessed it." "What are the terms?" "Spacious," Naomi replied. "Very spacious, almost everything." Rachel remained silent. "If you sign, the story will end." "And what if I don't sign?" Naomi asked. Rachel didn't answer immediately. "Then you'll face a long battle, legal, media, pressure from the board." Naomi looked back at the text on the screen. A number appeared on the last page. The compensation was large enough to make many people consider it a reasonable ending. "Rachel," Naomi said slowly. "If I sign, what happens to the truth?" Rachel hesitated. "It must not be revealed." Naomi muted the call, stood up and paced a few steps around the room. She felt a familiar weariness, but this time it was accompanied by a different feeling, a feeling of being cornered. She thought of her employees, those who depended on the company's stability. She thought of her mother, of the years that had taught her to be cautious, and she thought of the moldy loaf of bread, not because it's important, but because of everything it represents. Naomi opened her laptop and began carefully reading the NDA. Each clause was written to protect one side, not her side. Another passage caught Naomi's attention. Party A acknowledges that no discriminatory conduct occurred. Naomi paused. "No," she said aloud, even though no one was in the room. "I can't sign this." The phone vibrated. A message from an unknown number, different from the last time. "Sign the NDA. This will get worse." Naomi didn't know who sent it, but the message was clear. She returned to the table and looked at the document again. There are choices that are not defined by right or wrong, but by the price to pay. Naomi called Jonathan Hale back. "I will not sign," she said, without beating around the bush. Jonathan was silent for a few seconds. "Miss Carter, I urge you to reconsider. This is a generous offer." "I don't sell my silence," Naomi replied, "especially when it's built on a false report." Jonathan's voice grew colder. "If you decline, we will proceed accordingly." Naomi understood what that meant. "I understand. The call has ended." Naomi sat back, feeling a chill run through the room, even though the windows were closed. She had just refused a safe escape. The phone rang again. This time it was an email from the company's executive team. "We have been informed that she has rejected the agreement. The council will reconvene this afternoon." Naomi closed her eyes. Everything is tightening one turn at a time. Legal, media, businesses, they all speak the same language: silence to survive. Naomi opened the document from last night, looking back at the words she had typed. They weren't complete, but they were real. She saved the file, giving it a very simple name: Flight 782, full account. Naomi didn't send it. Not yet. She stood up, put on her coat, and prepared to go out. There were meetings she couldn't avoid. There were stares she would have to face. But deep down, Naomi had made a very clear decision. If the system only allowed two choices, to remain silent for peace or to speak up and pay the price, she would have chosen that. And she wouldn't let herself pay that price alone. The conference room on the 32nd floor of the company headquarters was so quiet that morning that Naomi Carter could hear the steady hum of the air conditioner on the ceiling. The glass walls overlooking San Francisco Bay reflected the pale gray sky and indistinct color, much like the mood of the people sitting around the long table. Naomi arrived 10 minutes early. She always arrived early for important meetings. Not to show off her power, but to have time to observe. Who was looking at whom? Who was avoiding eye contact? Who had already made decisions before the meeting began? Today, those signs are clearer than ever. Thomas Green, the chairman of the board, sat at the head of the table. He didn't look at Naomi when she entered. Linda Park, the representative of the company's largest investment fund, flipped through the documents in front of her, her eyes fixed on the numbers. Several other members nodded to Naomi politely but distantly. Rachel Moore sat in the corner of the room, not as a speaker but as an observer. She gave Naomi a very brief glance, enough to say, "Be careful." The meeting started on time. "Thank you all for being here," Thomas Green said. "We all know the reason for today's meeting." Naomi nodded. "Yes." Thomas continued, his voice calm but not soft. "The media situation is directly impacting the stock price and partner confidence." Linda Park interjected, "We've received 3 calls from strategic clients in the last 24 hours. They're asking for clarification on the company's position." Naomi looked directly at Linda. "What is the company's position?" Linda paused briefly, then replied, "That we do not tolerate behavior that harms frontline workers." Naomi took a slow breath. Even if that accusation isn't true. No one answered immediately. Thomas Green clasped his hands together. "Naomi, it's not just about right or wrong. It's about public perception." That statement fell onto the meeting table like a heavy object. Naomi had heard it before, but never had it been said so bluntly in a room where she used to make strategic decisions for the entire company. "Public perception is built on information," Naomi said. "And right now that information is being distorted." Linda Park flipped a page of the document. "We're not here to argue about the details. We're here to minimize the damage." Naomi looked around the table. The familiar faces, the ones who had once supported her, now avoided eye contact. Not because they hated her, but because they were afraid. They're afraid of shareholders. They're afraid of the media. They're afraid of being dragged into a controversy they can't control. "So what is the council's proposal?" Naomi asked. Thomas Green cleared his throat. "We are asking you to temporarily step down from your role as CEO. During this time, the company will conduct an internal review." "For now," Naomi repeated. That word reappeared as an escape without a clear time limit. Rachel Moore clenched her hands in her lap. Naomi didn't look at her. She didn't need any further signals to understand what was happening. "I want to clarify," Naomi said, her voice still calm. "On what conclusion was this decision made?" Thomas replied. "Based on risk." "Whose risk is it?" Naomi asked. The atmosphere in the room became heavy. Linda Park looked down at the documents. Another member cleared their throat. "Naomi," Thomas said, lowering his voice. "You know I respect you. But sometimes, for the common good, one has to step aside." Naomi was silent. In her mind, the pieces began to fit together. The NDA was denied. The false report was disseminated. The media pressure. And now this. No one is saying she's wrong. But no one is saying she's right either. "Am I allowed to speak before a decision is made?" Naomi asked. Thomas nodded. "Of course." Naomi stood up, not to speak eloquently, just so she wouldn't have to sit lower than those who were deciding her fate. "I built this company on one principle," Naomi said slowly. "That integrity isn't a slogan, but how we behave when it's not in our best interest." She looked at each person individually. If today we choose to push someone aside simply because the story is being told incorrectly, then tomorrow it could happen to anyone in this room. No one objected, but Naomi didn't see any change either. Thomas Green sighed. "Naomi, we've voted." Naomi nodded. She wasn't surprised. "The decision takes effect today," Thomas continued. "We will issue a press release within an hour." Naomi sat down. In that moment she felt something very specific leave her. Not self-esteem, but place. A place she spent nearly 10 years building. Rachel Moore walked in when the meeting ended. "Naomi, I'm sorry," she said softly. Naomi smiled faintly. "It's all right. I did what I could." Naomi tidied up some personal papers in her office. Not many. A small picture frame, a notebook, a pen. She didn't bring her company laptop. Not because she was asked to, but because she didn't want to. As Naomi stepped out of the elevator, her phone vibrated. A news notification appeared almost immediately. CEO steps aside. Amid airline controversy, Naomi looked at the headline and didn't feel the pain she had expected. Perhaps it was because deep down she had prepared for this moment. But then another notification appeared. Sources say board loses confidence in leadership. Naomi stopped in front of the car. The wind blew harder, carrying the afternoon chill. She stood there alone in the wide parking lot, feeling the silence envelop her. Loss of position, loss of official voice, loss of control over the narrative. Naomi opened the car door and sat in the back seat. As the car started moving, she looked back at the glass building behind her, the place she used to walk into every morning with a sense of purpose. The phone vibrated again. A new email, not from the board, not from communications, from an unfamiliar address. The title consists of only 4 words. "I was there." Naomi stared intently at the screen. She didn't open the email right away. The car turned onto the road along the bay. The city sped by like a silent film. Naomi clearly sensed that as one door closed, other doors, though unseen, began to tremble slightly, and that this collapse may not be the end. Naomi Carter's apartment had never been so quiet. Not the pleasant tranquility of an ordinary evening, but the heavy silence that follows the closing of a large door. No more work emails to answer. No more packed meeting schedules. No more just 5-minute calls. Naomi sat on the living room floor, her back against the sofa. Her office attire had been replaced with an old, soft, loose sweater. She hadn't turned on the lights. Only the dim street lights cast long streaks across the wooden floor. She opened the email with the subject line, "I was there." Not immediately, but after sitting still for almost 10 minutes, allowing my heart rate to slow down. Short email, no signature, no lengthy explanation. "I was sitting in seat 3C. I saw the loaf of bread. I heard what she said, and I have the full video." Naomi read it over and over again. Not because she didn't believe it, but because she was afraid to believe it. She has lost too much in the past few days to dare to hope again. Naomi set her laptop aside and hugged her knees. In that moment, all the layers of composure she had cultivated over the years began to crumble. She thought of the meeting room, of the averted gazes, of the word temporary used as a sedative for the collective conscience. She thought of the young employees who had emailed her saying they saw themselves in Naomi's journey. Black and brown women who always had to prove themselves twice to be even half believed. And now she wonders where she has led them. Is it worth it? The question echoed in Naomi's head, not loudly but persistently. Was it worth it when the truth couldn't protect her from loss? Is it worth it when a moldy loaf of bread becomes the catalyst for an entire career? Naomi rested her forehead on her knees, allowing herself to cry for the first time in years. No sobbing, no noise, just silent tears falling onto the sleeves of the sweater. She didn't cry because she was treated unfairly. She was used to it. She cried because of the feeling of loneliness, standing in the right place, but with no one to stand with her. The phone vibrated softly on the table. Naomi didn't look. Then it vibrated again. Finally, she reached out and took it. The name Evelyn Carter appeared on the screen. "I'm listening," Naomi said, her voice hoarse. "Where are you?" Evelyn asked. "At home." "Can Mom come?" Evelyn asked again. Without waiting for an answer, she replied, "She's on her way." Naomi didn't object. Less than 40 minutes later, there was a knock on the door. Naomi got up and opened it. Evelyn Carter stood there, her thick coat, her hair neatly tied up, her eyes a mixture of worry and determination. She walked in saying nothing immediately. She just hugged Naomi very tightly. Naomi stood still in her mother's arms, feeling a familiar sensation she had long forgotten, the feeling of being able to lean on someone without needing an explanation. "I'm not okay," Naomi said softly as they sat down. Evelyn nodded. "I know, Mom. I've lost everything," Naomi said. "My job, my reputation, my voice." Evelyn looked at her daughter. "You've lost your place. You're not human." Naomi shook her head. "Out there, they're calling me a bully." Evelyn sighed slowly. "Out there, they're not living my life." The mother and daughter sat in silence for a moment. Naomi looked at the cup of tea Evelyn had just poured, the steam rising gently. "Mom, do you think I was wrong not to sign the NDA?" Naomi asked. It was a question she hadn't dared voice to anyone before. Evelyn didn't answer immediately. She thought for a long time. "If you sign," Evelyn said, "you will keep your peace. But you will lose something that no one else will see." Naomi looked up. "What is it?" "It's the ability to look directly into a mirror," Evelyn replied. Naomi closed her eyes. A long sigh escaped her lips. "But I'm so tired, Mom," Naomi said. "I don't know if I have the strength to go any further." Evelyn placed her hand on Naomi's. "No one is forcing you to be strong all the time, but don't confuse exhaustion with regret." Naomi didn't reply, but the words stayed with her. After Evelyn left, Naomi returned to the living room. She opened her laptop again and looked at the email that read, "I was there." She typed a reply, then deleted it, typed again, stopped. Naomi didn't want to rush into a blind counterattack. She'd seen too many people do it, only to be drawn into another whirlwind. She needs to be sure. Naomi gave a very brief answer. "Thank you. I need to see the video. But first I need to know why you contacted me." Send. Naomi closed her laptop, stood up and went out onto the balcony. The night wind was colder, but she didn't go back inside. She stood there looking down at the city, feeling the rhythm of life continue. For the first time since being asked to step aside, Naomi didn't feel completely empty anymore. She still grieves, but in that void something is forming. Not anger, not revenge. It's about clarity. If truth has a price, Naomi has already paid the first part of that price. And if she must move forward, she will not do so with anger but with patience. The phone vibrated. A new email. Sender Daniel Brooks. The content consists of only one sentence: "Because I don't want my daughter to grow up in a world where the truth always loses." Naomi read the words for a long time. She didn't smile, but she stood straighter. At its deepest point, Naomi Carter did not find complete collapse. She found a small anchor point. And sometimes, just a point of support like that is enough to start over. Naomi Carter did not reply to Daniel Brooks' email that night. It wasn't because she doubted his good intentions. Rather, Naomi had learned that in the most vulnerable moments, caution is the greatest form of self-protection. The next morning, as the first rays of sunlight streamed through the window, Naomi sat back down at her desk. She had slept for a few hours, her first uninterrupted sleep since leaving the meeting room that day. Not deep sleep, but enough to clear her head. Naomi opened her laptop and reread Daniel Brooks' email. The wording was simple, no dramatization, just a very relatable reason. "Because I don't want my daughter to grow up in a world where the truth always loses." Naomi typed her reply, this time without deleting it. "Daniel, thank you for contacting me. I need to see the full video and understand the context in which you filmed it. If you agree, we can talk. Send." Less than 10 minutes later, a reply email arrived. "I'm ready. I don't want to appear in public. I just want the truth to be said. I'm in San Mateo." Naomi read slowly, line by line. She didn't feel excited, she felt clear-headed. That was the state she trusted most. She called Rachel Moore. "Rachel," Naomi said when the call connected. "There's a witness. He says he has the full video." Rachel was silent for a few seconds. "Are you sure?" "Not yet," Naomi replied. "But I'll check." Rachel sighed. "I'll go with you." "No," Naomi said softly. "Not yet. I need to see it first. No media, no lawyers, just the truth." Rachel understood. "Be careful." Naomi left the apartment dressed simply. No heavy makeup, no sunglasses. She didn't want to attract attention. Right now, Naomi needed to remain hidden, not to appear in public. The small cafe in San Mateo was nestled on a quiet street. When Naomi entered, Daniel Brooks was already seated in the far corner. He was a man in his early 40s with a sturdy build and short haircut. His gaze was wary but not hostile. Daniel stood up when he saw Naomi. "Miss Carter." "Naomi," she replied. "Thank you for coming." They sat down. No handshakes, no lengthy pleasantries. Daniel placed the old phone on the table, not turning it on immediately. "I'm not the type to get involved in trouble," he said. "But what I saw that day wasn't right." Naomi nodded. "Where are you sitting?" "It's a 3C, Daniel replied. "I'm filming this for my daughter. She loves airplanes." Naomi smiled very slightly. "And you filmed it all?" Daniel opened his phone and found a video file. "Almost. I didn't intend to film anyone, but the camera was still playing." He placed the phone in the middle of the table, turning the screen towards Naomi. The video begins. The image was slightly shaky but clear. First class. Low background noise. Naomi saw herself in seat 2A. She saw Emily Ross setting down her food tray. She saw Naomi pointing at the loaf of bread. And then the sayings. "Some people should be grateful just to be sitting up here." Naomi closed her eyes for a second. Not because of pain, but because of confirmation. The video continues. Michael Turner appears. The familiar line plays uncut. "This is a clearly defined mold." Naomi opened her eyes. Her heart was beating slowly but steadily. Daniel paused the video at the point where Emily was being led away. There was no shouting, no threats. No Naomi demanding that anyone be disciplined. "This is the whole thing," Daniel said. "No editing, no cutting or splicing." Naomi sat still. She didn't say thank you right away. She needed a moment to put everything in its place. "Why don't you upload this video online?" Naomi asked. Daniel shook his head. "I used to be in the military. I know what happens when the crowd takes sides. I don't want my daughter to see her father throw someone into the fire." Naomi looked at Daniel for a long time. "You know that if this video gets out, you'll get a lot of attention." Daniel nodded. "I know. And he still keeps in touch with me," Naomi said. Daniel looked directly at her. "Because I saw that you weren't shouting. You weren't humiliating anyone. You were just asking to be treated kindly." Naomi took a deep breath. In that moment she felt something she had been missing for days. Not loud support, but quiet affirmation. Naomi asked Daniel to send the original video file via an encrypted hard drive. No cloud storage, no email. Daniel agreed. "What are you going to do with it?" Daniel asked. Naomi thought for a moment. "Not now. I need to piece it together with the other pieces." "Which pieces?" Daniel asked. Naomi stood up. "Internal reports, emails, accounts from others." Daniel frowned. "Do you think there are others?" Naomi nodded. "Always." On the way home, Naomi called Rachel Moore. "Rachel," Naomi said. "The video is real. It's complete." Rachel held her breath. "Are you sure?" "Certainly," Naomi replied. "But we're not releasing it right away." Rachel was silent. "Naomi, if you had this, everything could be turned around. Or worse," Naomi said. "If it's done at the wrong time." Rachel understood. "I'll keep it a secret." Naomi arrived home and placed the hard drive in a small safe. She didn't replay the video. She didn't need to. Instead, Naomi opened her laptop and logged into an old email account, the one she used when she first started her business. Not many people knew about it. She drafted a short email and sent it to 3 addresses. An independent lawyer she trusted. An investigative journalist who had previously turned down many sensational stories. And a former airline employee who had sent Naomi a message of support and then gone silent. The email didn't have a video attached. It only contained one sentence. If you ever believed that truth needs to be properly protected, I have a story that needs verification. No rush, no publication, just verification. Naomi pressed send. She sat there feeling something very different from the days before. Not exhilaration, not revenge. It's about preparation. Outwardly, the story was still being told in someone else's way. But for the first time, Naomi wasn't being swept along by it. She is rebuilding the ground beneath her feet, brick by brick. The phone vibrated. A message from an unknown number. I have something too. I worked that flight. Naomi looked at the screen. She wasn't in a hurry to answer. She smiled very gently. The seeds have been sown. And it's starting to sprout. The message displayed on Naomi Carter's phone screen wasn't long, just one sentence. But it carried a weight far different from the abusive messages she had become accustomed to seeing over the past few days. I worked that flight. I saw everything. Naomi didn't answer immediately. She learned that when the truth begins to emerge, the most dangerous thing is not the lack of evidence, but being too quick to believe you have enough. Naomi put down the phone and walked around the apartment. She didn't turn on the music. She didn't turn on the TV. She let her thoughts collide in silence, an inside witness. If that's true, then this story is no longer just one passenger's testimony versus a flight attendant's report. It becomes a larger structure, systemic, accountable. Naomi returned to her desk, opened her laptop, and created a new folder. She gave it a very simple name, Timeline. She began to write down each milestone. The time the sandwiches were served, Emily Ross's statement, Michael Turner's reaction, internal report submitted after landing, edited video surfaced online. NDA sent. Naomi looked at that timeline and realized one thing: the festive Defordians. Very clearly. The truth is not distorted randomly. It is rearranged. The phone rang again, the same number. I can't talk on the phone, but I'm willing to meet. Naomi typed her reply, this time without hesitation. I need to know who you are and what you need to feel safe. A while later, a response came. My name is Sarah Mitchell. I was the cabin attendant on that flight. I don't want to go public. I just want things to be said correctly. Naomi read very slowly. Sarah Mitchell. A name that didn't appear in any articles, not the main character, not the focus. But often it is those on the periphery who see best what is happening in the center. Naomi called Rachel Moore. Rachel. Naomi said, her voice low but firm. There was another flight attendant on the flight. She says she witnessed everything. Rachel held her breath. Naomi, if that's true, the internal report didn't fully reflect the truth, Naomi said. And it's no longer a personal misunderstanding. Rachel was silent for a few seconds. You want to meet her? Yes, Naomi replied. But not as an interview, rather as a safe conversation. Rachel understood. I'll contact an independent lawyer. We need to protect her before we can protect the story. Naomi nodded, though Rachel couldn't see. Yes. The meeting took place 2 days later in a small office belonging to lawyer Mark Ellison, the same lawyer Naomi had emailed earlier. No logo, no large sign. Just a neutral space, private enough that no one felt threatened. Sarah Mitchell arrived 10 minutes after Naomi. She was in her early 30s, her hair neatly tied back her face, showing the fatigue of many sleepless nights. When she saw Naomi, she paused at the door, clearly deep in thought. Naomi stood up first. Thank you for coming. Sarah nodded without smiling. I'm not doing this for you, she said bluntly. I'm doing it because I can't stand having things told wrong. Naomi didn't argue. I understand. They sat down. Mark Ellison explained very clearly about her rights, her confidentiality, and that Sarah was not obligated to say anything that would make her feel unsafe. Sarah listened, then nodded. I'm just telling you what I saw with my own eyes. And then she began. I was standing in the kitchen area after Emily served that tray, Sarah said. I heard her say something about, some people should be grateful to be sitting here. Naomi closed her eyes for a moment. Not out of surprise, but to confirm it a second time. I didn't see a strong reaction from Mrs. Carter, Sarah continued. She just pointed to the loaf of bread. Sarah looked at Naomi, a hint of remorse in her eyes. I remember it very clearly, because at that moment I thought, if it were me, I wouldn't have been able to stay so calm. Mark Ellison asked, have you seen any disciplinary requests from passengers? Sarah shook her head. No. Not at all. She just asked to speak to the person in charge. Sarah took a deep breath as if preparing for the hardest part. After landing, Emily told me she was going to write the report. She was furious. Naomi opened her eyes. What did she say? Sarah hesitated. She said that, if she didn't write it that way, she would be the one considered wrong. The room was completely silent. No one interrupted. Sarah bowed her head. I didn't do anything. I thought it was best to keep quiet. Naomi didn't blame them. She understood that feeling better than anyone. So why are you contacting me now? Naomi asked very softly. Sarah looked up. Because I saw the edited video, and I saw people calling her a bully. I couldn't stand it. Sarah clenched her fists. I've been silent long enough. Naomi looked at Sarah, not with the gaze of a CEO or someone seeking proof. Rather, she looked at another human being standing on a very fragile boundary. You owe me nothing, Naomi said. But if you choose to speak out, I won't leave you alone. Sarah didn't cry, but her eyes were red. The meeting ended without signatures, no agreement reached. Only a sealed record and an unwritten moral pledge. On the way home, Naomi sat in the car for a long time without turning on the radio. She thought of Daniel Brooks and Sarah Mitchell, two strangers yet holding on to pieces of the same puzzle. The truth, it turned out, was that she wasn't as alone as she had thought. Rachel Moore called just as Naomi arrived home. Naomi, Rachel, said, her voice trembling slightly. The lawyer said, if there's an inside witness, the whole story will take a different turn. I know, Naomi replied, but we haven't announced it yet. Rachel was silent. What are you waiting for? Naomi looked out the window. The late afternoon sun cast a soft golden hue over the city. I'm waiting for the moment when the truth will not only be shocking, Naomi said, but will force people to listen. Rachel understood. I'll keep things as low-key as possible. Naomi nodded. That evening, Naomi rewatched Daniel Brooks's video. This time, she watched it not as a victim, but as someone preparing to tell a story bigger than her own. She paused the video at the moment Emily Ross turned her back and walked away. Naomi felt no anger. She saw a system that had pushed many people into making the wrong choices. The phone vibrates. A new email from the investigative journalist Naomi had contacted earlier. I've checked the internal report. There are several discrepancies regarding the timelines. If you're available, I'd like to meet. Naomi closed her laptop and leaned back in her chair. The balance is beginning to shift, quiet, not public. But it was enough to shake even the most solid foundations. And Naomi knew that the hardest part ahead wasn't proving herself right. Rather, it's about choosing the right moment for the truth to be seen, not as a counterattack, but as a quiet, yet undeniable reminder. Naomi Carter did not release the video the following day. She didn't do it the next day either. Outwardly, many believed Naomi was silent out of fear. Some comments began to appear analyzing that silence as a sign of guilt. The hashtag #StandWithEmily continued to spread, but it was no longer as explosive as before. It began to repeat itself. Naomi watched it all but didn't react. It wasn't because she was waiting for a miracle. Rather, she was waiting for the system to reveal what it always does when it's overconfident, a contradiction. On Tuesday morning, after her meeting with Sarah Mitchell, Naomi received an email from investigative journalist James Holloway. Brief title: Timeline Discrepancy Confirmed. Naomi opened the email and read it slowly. James compared the airline's internal report with flight radar data, cockpit time logs, and unofficial testimony from a ground staff member. At least 3 time points could not have occurred simultaneously, as described in the report. In other words, that report wasn't just biased, it cannot be logically correct. Naomi leaned back in her chair. This was what she had been waiting for. It's not emotional evidence, it's systematic evidence. James continued, if you release the video now, the story will revolve around emotions. If you wait another 24 to 48 hours, it will revolve around the deliberate distortion of the truth. Naomi smiled very slightly. She called Rachel Moore. Rachel, Naomi said, it's time to get ready. Rachel was silent for a few seconds, then replied finally. Not a press conference, Naomi continued. No talk show. No face-to-face confrontation. Rachel understood immediately. A controlled release. Naomi nodded, yes, and only once. That afternoon, the airline issued a new statement. After further review, we confirm that the initial report accurately reflects the employee's perspective at the time. Naomi read the message very carefully. No corrections. No further apologies. A defensive statement. And that's exactly what she needed. Naomi forwarded the press release to James Holloway with a single line. They have locked their position. James replied almost immediately. Then we can unlock the truth. That evening, Naomi reopened the timeline folder. She added new milestones. Second airline press release. Confirmation of time discrepancies. Internal witnesses available to testify. Original video with full metadata. Naomi wasn't nervous. She felt it clearly. She wrote a letter, not long, not confrontational, not accusatory. It's just an account. I have been silent long enough to listen. Now I will tell you exactly what happened, not for self-defense, but so that the truth will no longer be used as a tool. The letter doesn't mention Emily Ross by name. It doesn't mention the airline by its legal name. It doesn't mention Naomi losing her CEO position. Just mention people. Naomi sent the manuscript to Rachel and James. After reading it, Rachel called back, her voice slightly choked. Naomi, this isn't a counterattack. This is testimony. That's what I want, Naomi replied. At exactly 9 a.m. The following day, James Holloway posted his investigation. No sensational headlines. No emotional overtones. The title is simple: What Really Happened on Flight 782. The article begins with a cold, impersonal sentence. When an official report doesn't match the real-time situation, the question isn't who's right, but why the facts need to be distorted. Inside the article is original unedited video, analysis of time discrepancies, confirmation by Sarah Mitchell, anonymous. Original airline response. Naomi has not commented. There were no self-defense statements. For the first 30 minutes, social media was unusually silent. Then something rare happened. People watched the whole video. No editing, no background music, no scrolling text, just the truth, raw and slow. One comment appeared and was shared thousands of times. This isn't what they told us. Another comment. Why did they cut that part out? The hashtag number stand with Emily is starting to slow down. A new hashtag has emerged, not created by Naomi. Number Flight 782 full video. Naomi sat in her apartment watching the reactions unfold, little by little. No celebration, no sigh of relief. She just observed. Rachel texted, the airline board is having an emergency meeting. James added, a major news outlet is verifying the article. Naomi's phone rang. An unknown number. Naomi answered the phone. Miss Carter, a man's voice rang out, more tense than before. This is Jonathan Hale. We need to talk. Naomi didn't answer immediately. She looked out the window. The morning sun shone on the city just like every other day. What do you want to say? Naomi asked. Jonathan lowered his voice. Circumstances have changed. Naomi nodded, though he couldn't see. They're always like that when the truth is revealed. The call ended quickly. Naomi put the phone down. For the first time in days, she was no longer someone being swept along by the tide of events. She didn't win against anyone. But the system has begun to reveal cracks that it can no longer conceal. And when that happens, the story no longer belongs to Naomi Carter. It belongs to those who have seen, heard, and started asking questions. That morning, Naomi Carter woke up to a very different atmosphere. It wasn't because the sunlight outside the window was brighter. It was because the phone on the bedside table no longer vibrated frantically with its familiar panicked rhythm. Notifications still came, but more slowly, more orderly, and most importantly, no longer angry. Naomi sat up and opened her phone. The first headline she saw was uncapitalized and not sensational. Unedited footage raises questions about airline's initial report. She glided down. Another article from a larger news outlet. What we missed in the Flight 782 narrative. Naomi put down the phone and closed her eyes for a moment. Not to enjoy it, but to prevent herself from getting carried away by the feeling of relief too soon. Rachel Moore called shortly after. Naomi, Rachel said, her voice trembling with emotion. Things are changing. The editors are updating the old posts. Some people have deleted tweets. Delete, Naomi repeated. Yes, Rachel said. No apology, just delete it. Naomi nodded. She was used to the world correcting its mistakes in such a quiet way. What about Emily Ross? Naomi asked. Rachel paused for a moment. Her lawyer just released a statement. They said she's under severe psychological stress and requested that she not be harassed. Naomi sighed. Good. Rachel was a little surprised. You aren't angry? Naomi looked out the window. No. I never wanted her to be a target. Rachel understood. But public opinion isn't that simple. We can't control them, Naomi said. We can only control how we react. At the same time, James Holloway sent a short message. 2 former crew members reached out. Similar stories, different flights. Naomi read the words for a long time, not because it was shocking, but because it confirmed what she had felt from the beginning. This is more than just a flight. On social media, the tone has noticeably changed. Comments that were once accusatory have begun to shift to questioning. Why was the report written that way? Who benefits from cutting the video? Why was she asked to sign an NDA if nothing was wrong? It's no longer a matter of who is right and who is wrong. But why does the system react that way? Naomi didn't post anything. She didn't give interviews. She didn't tweet about winning. She only sent a short email to James Holloway. If there are more witnesses, protect them before protecting the story. James replied, that's exactly what we're doing. At lunchtime, Naomi received a call from Thomas Green. Naomi, his voice rang out, no longer as confident as before. I think we should talk. Naomi paused for a moment. About what? Thomas cleared his throat. The council is reviewing the decision. Naomi leaned back in her chair. Because of media pressure, Thomas didn't deny it. Because the context has changed. Naomi looked out onto the balcony. A gentle breeze was blowing. Contexts are always changing, Thomas. Principles don't. Thomas sighed. We can issue a corrective statement. And, no, Naomi interrupted very softly. I don't need a statement to come back. Thomas froze. Naomi, what did you say? Naomi spoke slowly, word by word. I don't want to go back to where I was by pretending nothing happened. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. We can apologize, Thomas said finally, publicly. Naomi closed her eyes for a second. Apologize to whom? Thomas didn't answer immediately. Apologize to me, Naomi continued, or apologize for the system, choosing convenience over truth. Thomas sighed. Naomi, you're making things more complicated. Naomi smiled very slightly. No, I just don't want to simplify it. The call ended without an agreement. Naomi put down the phone, feeling a strange sense of calm, not because she had won, but because she was no longer being dragged back to things that no longer belonged to her. That afternoon, a short video went viral, not from Naomi, but from another passenger on the flight, the one who had been silent. The video has only one sentence: "I didn't say anything then, I should have." Below the video are thousands of supportive comments. No attacks, no judgments, just very human acknowledgments. Naomi watched the video twice, then turned it off. She thought of Sarah Mitchell, of Daniel Brooks, of those who chose to speak out not for fame but to avoid betraying themselves. Rachel sent another message. Some civil society organizations want you to speak about the culture of silence. Naomi typed and deleted, then typed again. Not now, but maybe, soon. That evening, Naomi sat down at her desk. She opened the document, Flight 782, full account. No edits, no additions. She reread it from beginning to end as if reading her own story through a different lens. The question is no longer how to clear his name. The real question is, how can we prevent this from happening again? The phone vibrated. A message from Daniel Brooks. My daughter asked me why people didn't believe the truth at first. I didn't know how to answer. Naomi stared at the words for a long time. She replied, perhaps the truth takes time, but it always needs someone to protect it. Naomi stood up and walked out onto the balcony. The city below was still noisy, still indifferent, still going on. But somewhere in small conversations, in those pauses before judgment, a shift had begun. The reversal didn't come as a big wave. It came like the tide, slow, silent, but unstoppable. And Naomi Carter knew that the hardest thing to do next wasn't to keep the truth standing. Instead, it's about using it to open a new path, not just for myself, but for those who will occupy seat 2A later. Naomi Carter sat alone in the small conference room of lawyer Mark Ellison's office. There were no more spotlights, no cameras, no journalists. Just a simple wooden table, a few thin files, and a silence very different from the early days of the storm. Mark Ellison placed a proposal in front of Naomi. Not an employment contract. Not a legal agreement. A memo. This is the latest proposal from the board, Mark said. They want you back as CEO, full authority, along with a formal apology. Naomi didn't touch the papers right away. She looked out the window where the midday sun shone on the sidewalk where ordinary people were passing by, completely unaware that a very small decision in this room could change so much. The conditions, Naomi asked. Mark turned to the next page. No litigation. No further mention of the matter after the statement. And an unofficial clause. Naomi turned to look at him. What is it? They want you to help calm public opinion, to reassure people that this is just a personal misunderstanding. Naomi smiled very slightly. Once more. Mark didn't answer. He knew Naomi understood. Rachel Moore sat opposite her, hands resting on the table, silent from the beginning of the meeting. She looked at Naomi, her eyes a mixture of hope and anxiety. Naomi, Rachel said finally, if you come back you can change everything from the inside. Naomi turned to Rachel. Do you really believe that? Rachel hesitated. I want to believe. Naomi nodded. She stood up, picked up the proposal, but didn't open it. She just felt its weight in her hand. 10 years ago, Naomi dreamed of one day being given that chair, not for the power, but for the ability to make a positive impact. And now that chair is placed before her again, but in a different way. One way to ask her is to simplify the truth. Naomi placed the stack of papers on the table. Mark, she said. What happens if I refuse? Mark sighed. They'll go their own way, maybe better, maybe not, but they won't have her. Naomi nodded. And me. You'll be free, Mark replied. But there won't be that chair. Naomi smiled. This time the smile was more pronounced. Then I know the answer. Rachel looked up. Naomi. Naomi raised her hand gently. Rachel, you once asked me, when the truth prevails, what do we use it for? Rachel nodded. I don't want to use it to go back to the place that told me to be silent, Naomi said. I want to use it to create a place where silence is no longer a condition for existence. The room fell silent. Mark Ellison nodded slowly. I'll let you know. Naomi left the lawyer's office on a quiet afternoon. No reporters waiting, no fancy cars. Just an ordinary taxi and the familiar streets of San Francisco. When she got back to her apartment, Naomi opened her laptop and logged into her old email account, the one she had used to communicate with Daniel Brooks, Sarah Mitchell, and others. She wrote a generic email. No sensational headlines, no grand appeals. I'm not going back to where I started, but I'm not leaving either. I'm building something else, slower, smaller, but more honest. If you've ever been silent out of fear or spoken up and paid the price, I want to listen. Naomi didn't send it to the press. It wasn't published publicly. Only sent to 12 people, those who spoke up when they gained nothing from it. That evening, Naomi called her mother. I refused, Naomi said. Evelyn Carter didn't ask to refuse anything. How do you feel about it? Naomi thought for a moment. Light and scary. Evelyn chuckled softly. That's what freedom feels like. Naomi looked out onto the balcony. The city lights began to come on, one by one. Not dazzling, but enough to prevent it from being dark again. The phone vibrated. A message from Sarah Mitchell. I heard you refuse to come back. Thank you. Because that made me less scared. Then, another message from Daniel Brooks. My daughter said she wants to be brave like you. I didn't know what to say. Naomi closed her eyes. A warm sensation spread gently through her chest. Not victory, not glory. It's about meaning. In the following days, Naomi began meeting other people. No large conferences, no grand forums, just small private conversations where people told stories that had never been recorded before. Stories of being told not to make a big deal out of it. About NDAs being given as a condition of survival. About truths being cut out because they were inappropriate. Naomi doesn't promise to change the world. She simply listened and took notes. One afternoon, Rachel Moore came to visit Naomi, no longer in her role as communications director. Just Rachel. You're doing what many people in the industry fear most, Rachel said. You're setting a precedent. Naomi smiled. Do you think the world needs more precedents or more CEOs? Rachel laughed, then fell silent. Perhaps it's precedent. Naomi closed her laptop and stood up. I don't know where I'm going, but I know I'm not turning back. Rachel nodded. I'll go with you, if you'll let me. Naomi looked at Rachel, her eyes warm. I'm so happy. That night, Naomi sat alone rereading her initial notes. She hadn't named the project. No logo, no communication strategy. There was only one handwritten line at the top of the page. The truth doesn't need to be loud. It needs people patient enough to keep it alive. Naomi put down her pen. Little did she know that what she was starting would spread further than she imagined. Not quickly, but sustainably. And that sometimes the bravest choice isn't to return to the top. Instead, it's about creating a different path, where those who come after don't have to pay the same price. 1 year after Flight 782, no more articles mentioning Naomi Carter every day. No more hashtags attached to her name. No more heated controversies that once swept everything away like a storm, and Naomi found that to be good. She stood in a small room with no sign, no company logo. Only a row of windows opened onto the quiet Oakland neighborhood where she had grown up. On the opposite wall, a simple piece of paper was framed. Not a manifesto, not a slogan. It's just a handwritten sentence. Here, the truth is heard before it is judged. Naomi doesn't call this place an organization. She calls it a space for those who were once silent, and also for those who once said the wrong thing but want to correct it. Today is a small gathering. No media, no famous guests. Just 12 people sitting in a circle, each with a story to tell. Naomi wasn't standing in the center. She was sitting with them. A young woman recounted being asked to sign an NDA after reporting workplace discrimination. A middle-aged man spoke of having his statements edited out in an internal report. An anonymous flight attendant, not Sarah Mitchell, spoke very quietly about the pressure to write it according to procedure. Naomi listened. She offered no advice. She didn't change their story. She always asked only one question. What do you need to do to avoid being silent again? At the end of the circle sat Sarah Mitchell. No uniform, no name tag, just Sarah. When it was her turn, Sarah said slowly, "I don't want to be a hero. I just don't want to be someone who knows but remains silent." Naomi nodded. She said nothing more. In the corner of the room, Rachel Moore leaned against the wall, observing. No longer the communications director. No strategy needed. No message needed. After the meeting, Rachel walked over to Naomi. "You know," Rachel said softly, "sometimes I think, if you went back to being CEO, you could change things faster." Naomi smiled. "Maybe. But now," Rachel continued, "I see you changing in ways that are harder to see." Naomi looked out the window. Children ran past, laughing and playing. A neighbor was walking his dog. The most lasting changes, Naomi said, rarely cause a stir. That afternoon, Naomi received a handwritten letter. No address was clearly visible, just a familiar line of text inside. "My daughter asked why it takes so many people to tell the truth. I told her because no one should do it alone." Daniel Brooks. Naomi folded the letter and placed it in the drawer with the other letters. Not to hide it, but to remember it. On the same day, a short news item appeared on an aviation industry news website. Airline announces, review of internal reporting practices. No mention of Naomi, no mention of Flight 782. But Naomi knew something had shifted. It's not because she won. It's because too many people no longer accept the old ways. That evening, Naomi called her mother. "Mom, do you remember when you told me I had to be careful?" Naomi asked. Evelyn Carter smiled softly. "Mom remembers. I think Mom was right," Naomi said. "But maybe. I've also learned that being cautious doesn't mean staying silent forever." Evelyn paused for a moment. "I learned that the hardest way." Naomi didn't deny it. After the call, Naomi sat alone in the now empty room. She tidied up the chairs, arranging them neatly in a row. When she turned off the lights, she paused before the framed piece of paper on the wall. "Here the truth is heard, before it is judged." Naomi recalled the moment on the flight. The moldy loaf of bread. Emily Ross's gaze. The seemingly insignificant remark. "Some people should be grateful." Naomi is no longer angry. She didn't forget either. She understood that without that flight, without the false report, without the collapse, she would probably still be sitting in a high-rise office, busy and safe. But some forms of safety come at the cost of not being able to see other people, and Naomi chose to look. Another morning, a few months later, Naomi received an invitation to speak at a university. Not about management, not about leadership. The title consists of only 3 words, "When Silence Breaks." Naomi stood before the small auditorium. No platform, no bright lights. She began with a very simple sentence. "I'm not here to talk about how I've been treated unfairly. I'm here to talk about what happens when many people choose not to remain silent at the same time." There was no loud applause, only genuine attention. At the end, a black student stood up and asked, "Do you regret it?" Naomi thought for a moment, then replied, "I regret ever thinking that silence would protect me. But I don't regret choosing to speak out, even if it cost me a lot." The students nodded as if they had received what they needed. That evening, Naomi walked alone down the familiar street. No one recognized her. No one took a picture. No one asked her anything. And Naomi felt that was enough. Legacy, she understood, wasn't about titles, not about positions, not about what people attached their name to. Legacy is when another person in another place in a very ordinary moment chooses not to be silent because they know someone else was standing there before them. Naomi Carter paused, looking up at the dark sky. No stars shone brightly, but there was enough light to know that the night wasn't completely dark. She smiled. The story begins with a moldy loaf of bread, and it ends with something much simpler. Hope, not flashy, not perfect, but authentic enough to keep going. This story isn't just about a black woman being treated unfairly on a flight. It's a mirror reflecting so many familiar things in our lives, especially for those who have lived long enough to understand that silence isn't always peace. The biggest message of the story is, the truth is not always protected by power, but it always needs people to protect it. Naomi Carter didn't win because she was louder. She didn't win because she held a higher position. She upheld the truth because she was patient, calm, and never betrayed her own values, even at the cost of her career. At a certain age, we all face choices. Speak up or remain silent for the sake of peace. Adhere to principles or be flexible to survive. Protect the truth or protect safety. This story reminds us that you don't need to win against anyone. Just don't lose yourself. And sometimes one right action, even a small one, can pave the way for many others who follow. Healing doesn't come from being vindicated in front of a crowd. It comes from being able to look straight in the mirror each day and knowing that you didn't remain silent when you should have spoken up. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story until the end. If the story resonated with you even just a little, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next true, insightful, and humane stories. We can't change the whole world, but we can start by not remaining silent in the face of wrongdoing. Thank you for being here.